The pirate most people know is standing on a sun-bleached deck under a blazing Caribbean sky, a bottle of rum in one hand and a cutlass in the other. That version of the story is not wrong. It is simply incomplete. For a large stretch of the so-called golden age of piracy, some of the most successful captains on the Atlantic were not sailing through turquoise water at all. They were sailing through fog banks thick enough to hide a fleet, past floating ice the size of houses, in water cold enough to stop a swimmer's heart within minutes. And on the wooden ship that carried them through that cold, there was one thing they were almost never allowed to have. Fire. Not a campfire. Not a bonfire on deck. Not even, in the worst weather, the single small cooking flame below decks that fed the entire crew. A ship built of wood, sealed with tar, rigged in miles of dry rope, and packed with barrels of gunpowder was, in the plainest possible terms, a floating explosive charge fitted with sails. One careless spark could undo in minutes what months of plunder had built. So the question this video sets out to answer is not whether pirates got cold in the North Atlantic. They did badly. The real question is how several dozen men on a single ship stayed alive through freezing nights, ice-slick rigging, and North Atlantic storms, while the one tool every human instinct reaches for in the cold was treated as more dangerous than the cold itself. A single figure clings to the masthead near midnight, well north of any warm current, gripping a frozen rope with hands that no longer fully obey him. His breath comes out in a hard white cloud that vanishes instantly in the wind. Salt spray has frozen halfway down the rigging in a thin, glassy crust, and every line he grabs bites into fingers already gone half numb. Somewhere below him, in a hold packed with sleeping men, there is no fire burning, and there will not be one until dawn, if the weather allows it even then. He is not chasing warmth. He is chasing the next handhold, and the one after that, because losing his grip matters more, right now, than losing feeling in his hands. According to surviving ship's journals and court records from the period, this was not a rare inconvenience. It was standard practice on almost every wooden warship and merchant vessel of the era, and pirate crews inherited the same rule. Sailors who broke it, even by accident, are recorded reacting exactly the way you would expect. With panic. A fire at sea, with nowhere to run and no way to put real distance between a man and the flames, was considered by many seamen to be a worse death than drowning. This side of pirate history rarely makes it into film or television, for an obvious reason. The Caribbean version of piracy is easier to sell. Warm water, green islands, buried treasure. But the golden age of piracy was never confined to the tropics. Captains sailed north for a simple, practical reason that had nothing to do with romance. Enormous wealth moved through the North Atlantic every year, carried by fishing fleets and merchant convoys that dwarfed anything crossing the Caribbean at the same moment. Where the money went, the pirates eventually followed, whatever the temperature happened to be. The clearest proof of this sits in the early history of Newfoundland. Decades before the names Blackbeard or Bartholomew Roberts meant anything to anyone, an English privateer turned pirate named Peter Easton built something close to a private kingdom on that coastline. According to the Dictionary of Canadian Biography and letters written by English colonists at the time, Easton arrived off Newfoundland in the year 1612 with roughly 10 armed ships, and within weeks he effectively controlled the region. He built a fort at Harbor Grace, forced local fishermen to supply him, and by some estimates, pressed as many as 1,500 men into his service. He plundered 30 English vessels in a single raid on the harbor at St. John's. For a stretch of months, Peter Easton was, in every practical sense, the most powerful man on that coast, answerable to no king and no admiralty. Here is where the popular version of this story usually takes over, and where the documented one is more interesting. The popular version usually shows Easton and his men gritting their way through a full Newfoundland winter, a pirate stronghold buried in snow. The record says something different. Colonial journals kept by John Guy and Henry Kraut describe Easton's men spending 10 days that October dismantling their own fortification at Harbor Grace before sailing away. He arrived in spring. He left before true winter closed in. Even the most powerful pirate fleet on the North Atlantic coast, backed by 10 armed ships and well over 1,000 men, made the calculated decision that a Newfoundland winter was not a fight worth having. That single fact says a great deal about how seriously experienced sailors regarded the cold of these waters, and it sets up the real puzzle at the center of this video. Because more than a century later, other pirate crews did sail these same waters, closer to true winter, with worse luck and worse weather. They had no fort to retreat to, no shore base, and no open fire to fall back on when the cold set in. What kept these men alive is not what popular pirate stories usually claim, and by the end of this video you will understand exactly why a single lit flame could be feared aboard a pirate ship far more than an enemy broadside bearing down out of the fog. There is a second layer to this story worth flagging early, because it will come back at the very end. The rule against fire was not a temporary wartime restriction or quirk of one unusually strict captain. It applied on nearly every wooden ship afloat, from Royal Navy warships to ordinary merchant traders to the pirate vessels that preyed on both. A rule that consistent, obeyed by outlaws and naval officers alike, tends to exist for a reason far more serious than tradition. On a ship, that reason was simple physics wrapped in wood and gunpowder, and no amount of cold on deck was ever going to be enough to override it. What follows is not a story about men who found a clever workaround and beat the cold outright. It is a story about men who accepted a genuinely brutal trade, freezing hands and aching joints in exchange for a ship that did not burn out from under them, and who built an entire quiet survival culture around that trade without ever once being able to break the rule that made it necessary in the first place. To understand why a freezing crew would deny itself the most basic form of warmth, you first have to understand what a wooden sailing ship actually was, physically, from the inside out. Strip away the flags, the guns, and the legend, and a ship like the ones pirates favored in the early 1700s was a hull built almost entirely from seasoned oak and pine, its seams packed with oakum and sealed with hot tar, its 3 masts strung with miles of hemp rope treated in more tar, and its sails stitched from acres of dry canvas. Below deck sat barrels of gunpowder, sometimes hundreds of them, stored in a magazine that could turn the entire vessel into wreckage in a single detonation. Every plank, every rope, every sail was, by design, superb at holding a flame once one caught. Sailors of the period did not need modern science to understand this. They lived with the danger every single day, and their journals show it. The seaman Edward Barlow, whose journal covers decades of life at sea in the late 1600s, recorded several near catastrophes that illustrate exactly how thin the margin was. On one voyage, a pot of tar and rosin being heated on deck to reseal the hull boiled over into an open flame and very nearly set the entire ship alight before the fire was beaten out. On another occasion, a crewman left a lit candle burning in his cabin on the lower gun deck, close to smoldering rope fibbers used for caulking, and the resulting smoke sent men scrambling in a full panic before the flame was discovered and smothered. Barlow himself wrote about the particular dread that spread through a crew the instant the cry of fire went up, noting that with several hundred barrels of gunpowder stored below, the noise of fire aboard a ship was considered dreadful beyond almost anything else a sailor could face at sea. He also recorded a case where a quartermaster left a candle burning unattended in his cabin, close enough to a man recovering from a broken leg that the injured sailor, half choked by the smoke, had to drag himself across the deck to raise the alarm before the flame could spread further. These were not rare, isolated scares. They were common enough that seasoned sailors treated the smell of smoke below decks as an emergency before they had even confirmed there was a fire at all, because by the time flame was visible, it was often already too late to stop it from reaching the rigging or the hold. Reduced to its simplest terms, a ship of this period carried 3 categories of material a modern safety officer would never allow near an open flame. The hull and masts were seasoned timber, dried specifically because dry wood burns easily and completely. The rigging was tarred hemp rope, and tar itself was flammable by design, chosen because it also waterproofed rope and seams. Below the waterline sat the magazine, the ship's entire store of gunpowder, guarded and lined with a level of caution that reflected exactly how catastrophic a spark reaching that space would be. Every part of the ship's construction assumed fire was the enemy, long before a single sailor ever felt the cold. That near miss on Barlow's ship looked like chaos from the deck, not a calm inspection. A crewman below shouts the one word every sailor dreaded above almost any other. Men come pouring up through the hatches half-dressed, coughing, some already convinced the powder is caught. There is no calm search for the source. There is shouting, shoving, buckets of seawater thrown blind at smoke nobody can yet see the source of. Because with several hundred barrels of gunpowder sitting below their feet, nobody aboard is willing to wait and find out how bad it really is before acting. That reaction, described plainly in Barlow's own journal, was not panic without cause. It was the entirely rational response of men who understood exactly how little time they would have if the fire reached the wrong barrel. This fear shaped how every fire on board, even a legitimate one, was managed. The one open flame permitted on most ships of the period lived in the galley, in a fire hearth built specifically to contain it. According to period accounts of shipboard cooking, this hearth typically sat on a bed of sand layered over brick or stone, insulating the wooden deck beneath it from the heat above, with an iron or brick surround to keep sparks and embers from escaping. It was, by the standards of the day, an engineering solution to a problem that never fully went away. Even with all of that containment, the fire in the galley hearth was routinely doused the moment the sea turned rough. A ship pitching and rolling in a storm could easily spill embers, coals, or boiling fat across a wooden deck, and no captain was willing to trade the ship for a hot meal. That single operational rule created the exact situation this video is built around. The worst storms of the North Atlantic, the ones that brought freezing rain, sleet, and ice-slick rigging, were also the storms in which the galley fire was extinguished first and relit last. The moment a crew needed warmth most urgently was, by the ship's own safety rules, the moment they were guaranteed to have none. There is a myth worth addressing directly here, because it shows up constantly in fictional pirate stories. The image of a crew gathered around an open deck fire, passing bottles, warming their hands against the flames while snow falls around them, has no basis in the historical record for a working sailing vessel at sea. It is a scene built for a film set, not a ship. Deck fires of any kind, outside the contained galley hearth, were simply not something a competent captain allowed. in warm water or cold. The real historical truth is almost the opposite of the romantic version. Rather than more fire in the cold, ships often carried less, because rough winter seas made even the single sanctioned flame too dangerous to keep lit. So if fire was rationed, contained, and frequently extinguished at the exact moments the crew was coldest, the obvious question becomes what these men actually did instead. The answer involves layers of wool, a very specific piece of enclosed equipment that produced heat without an open flame, and a set of habits built entirely around denying the cold any opportunity to do lasting damage. That is where the next part of this story goes, into the practical, unglamorous machinery of staying alive on a freezing wooden ship, where the one obvious solution was permanently off the table. With open fire ruled out for most of a North Atlantic voyage, survival came down to a combination of clothing, controlled heat sources, and discipline. None of it glamorous, and all of it effective enough to keep crews alive for weeks at a time in genuinely brutal conditions. Clothing did most of the work. Historians studying the period, including Angus Constam and David Rickman, note that there is no real evidence pirates dressed any differently from other mariners of their era. Whatever image popular culture has built of a pirate's wardrobe, the actual working clothing worn aboard ship was chosen for one reason only: survival at sea, and it was largely identical whether the man wearing it was a licensed merchant sailor or an outlawed pirate. The standard cold weather garment was a short, heavy jacket known as a fearnought, cut from thick wool or a hard-wearing fabric called fustian, and named quite literally for its resistance to the elements. Fearnought jackets were cut short and close-fitting on purpose, so they would not snag on rigging or trail into machinery while a man worked aloft in freezing wind. Underneath, sailors layered woolen shirts and jerseys, sometimes what later sailors would call a guernsey or gansey, a tightly knitted wool garment that trapped body heat even when damp. In genuinely foul, wet weather, men reached for a longer waterproofed canvas coat over the top. And in the coldest conditions, knitted caps, wool stockings, and mittens completed the layering. None of it looked heroic. All of it was engineered, through decades of trial and error at sea, to keep a working man functional in weather that could otherwise kill him within hours. Pulling that clothing on before a freezing watch was its own small ordeal. Wool that had been soaked through the day before rarely dried completely below decks, so a man often forced damp, cold fabric over skin that was already shivering. Teeth clenched against the chill of it. There was no comfortable version of this ritual. A sailor simply endured the first few minutes of contact with wet wool, knowing that his own body heat, trapped inside the layers, would eventually turn that discomfort into something survivable. It was a small, repeated act of will performed every single watch, by men who had no other option and no illusion that it would ever feel pleasant. For direct, localized heat, crews relied on something closer to a covered ember box than a fire. Small metal chafing dishes, holding a portion of coals kept glowing rather than burning in the open, were used below decks to warm hands, dry small items, and take the worst edge off the chill in an enclosed space. This distinction matters enormously and is easy to miss. A chafing dish full of contained, smoldering coal is a fundamentally different hazard from an open flame licking at tarred rope and dry canvas. Sailors of the period clearly understood this difference, which is why heated coals in an enclosed container were tolerated in situations where an open blaze never would have been. It is also worth noting plainly that in the coldest and roughest stretches, even the officially sanctioned galley fire was extinguished, so these controlled coal sources became the closest thing to heat many crews had access to at all. And even then, only intermittently. Movement and crowding did the rest. Sailors on watch in freezing conditions worked in short, rotated shifts specifically because prolonged exposure without relief invited frostbite and exhaustion, both of which could kill just as effectively as the cold itself. Below decks, dozens of men sleeping in close quarters, packed into hammocks strung only inches apart, generated a genuine amount of shared body heat in a space that otherwise had no heating of its own. It was crowded. It smelled of unwashed wool and tar, and by every account it was uncomfortable in ways modern audiences rarely appreciate. But it worked. There is one more myth worth putting to rest here, because it is possibly the most persistent one in all of pirate lore, and it involves rum. Popular imagination treats alcohol as a reliable cure for cold, a warming shot passed around to fight off frostbite and misery. The physical reality works against the crew, not for them. Alcohol widens the blood vessels near the skin, which produces a genuine sensation of warmth, while actually accelerating the rate at which the body loses core heat to the surrounding air. It also blunts a man's ability to physically shiver, which is the body's own automatic mechanism for generating heat in the cold. A heavily intoxicated sailor on a freezing deck was, according to what is understood today about cold exposure, in more danger from the elements, not less, even while he felt warmer than he actually was. Rum on a Golden Age pirate ship served plenty of purposes, morale among them, but reliable protection from hypothermia was never one of them, whatever the legend says. Diet played a quieter but equally important role in whether a man survived the cold at all. Salted meat, ship's biscuit, and dried provisions kept a crew fed on a long voyage, but they did little to protect against the deeper physical toll of weeks spent cold, wet, and undernourished. According to what is understood about the health of long voyage sailors in this era, men already weakened by poor diet and the early stages of scurvy were measurably less able to withstand prolonged cold exposure than a well-fed man would have been, since the body's ability to generate and retain heat depends heavily on basic nutrition. A crew fighting off the early symptoms of scurvy while also fighting off frostbite was fighting two battles with the same depleted resources, and captains who kept any fresh food or citrus aboard, even by accident of a recent raid, were giving their men a genuine, if unintentional, advantage against the cold as well as the disease. Layered wool, contained coals instead of open flame, rotated watches, and shared body heat below decks were not dramatic solutions. They were the accumulated, unglamorous survival wisdom of generations of North Atlantic sailors, and pirate crews inherited every part of it. The next question is what happened when that system was pushed to its limit, when a storm hit hard enough and the cold arrived early enough that even these careful habits were barely enough to keep a crew alive. The clearest test of this entire system did not come from a captain who chose to winter in the far north. It came from a crew that simply stayed too long chasing profit in a region where the seasons did not forgive miscalculation. In June of 1720, the pirate captain Bartholomew Roberts, known to history as Black Bart, sailed his fleet north from the Caribbean and into the harbor at Piracy, Newfoundland, one of the busiest fishing and fish salting centers on the entire coast. According to multiple period accounts, Roberts entered the harbor under full black flags, drums beating and trumpets sounding, and the effect on the 22 merchant ships anchored there was immediate. Their captains and crews abandoned their vessels without firing a single shot, leaving Roberts and a crew reportedly numbering only around 60 men in complete command of a harbor holding roughly 1,200 sailors across those ships, and another 150 fishing boats. It remains one of the most lopsided psychological victories of the entire golden age of piracy, achieved through reputation alone rather than a fight. Roberts stayed into July, raiding further along the coast and capturing additional French vessels before turning south again for warmer water. This raid matters for a reason that has nothing to do with the theatrics of the Black Flag. Roberts, like Peter Easton before him, timed his entire Newfoundland campaign for summer. He arrived in June and was gone before autumn turned toward true winter. This was not caution born of fear. Roberts is remembered by contemporaries as one of the most fearless captains of the entire era. A man who once attacked 22 ships with a single 10-gun sloop and 60 men. If a captain with that level of nerve still chose to keep his North Atlantic raids strictly to the warmer months, that decision tells you everything about how seriously even the boldest pirates in history rated the danger of a true northern winter at sea. The real danger these crews faced was not a full winter, then. It was the shoulder season, the weeks in late autumn or early spring, when a ship could still be caught on the Grand Banks by a sudden storm, dense fog, or drifting ice, all while still operating under summer expectations. According to sailors' accounts from the wider region, fog on the Grand Banks could close in within minutes, cutting visibility to almost nothing, even as temperatures dropped sharply after dark. Rigging exposed to freezing spray could ice over, turning simple tasks like handling a sail or climbing to the yards into genuinely dangerous work, with a man's hands losing feeling and his grip failing exactly when he needed it most. The Grand Banks themselves made this danger worse than almost anywhere else on the Atlantic. The shallow waters there sit directly beneath the meeting point of the cold Labrador current flowing south and the warmer Gulf Stream flowing north. A collision that produces some of the thickest, most persistent fog on the planet, often with almost no warning before it rolls in. Icebergs calved from Arctic glaciers drift south through these same waters well into the warmer months. Invisible in fog and just as lethal to a wooden hull as any Royal Navy cannon. A crew that had sailed north under clear summer skies could find itself, within the space of a single day, fighting freezing spray, zero visibility, and drifting ice, with nothing but a compass, a lead line, and raw seamanship standing between the ship and disaster. It was in these conditions, caught between seasons rather than deep inside a deliberate winter voyage, that the fireban became its most dangerous. A crew hit by a sudden freezing storm on the open Atlantic could not simply light a fire to fight off the cold. The reality of one of these storms was closer to chaos than to any orderly ship's routine. Fog rolls in fast enough to swallow the bow while the stern is still in clear air. Sleet turns the deck slick within minutes, and every line a man reaches for has already begun to stiffen with a thin skin of ice. Somewhere above, a sail needs reefing before the wind tears it apart. And the men sent aloft to do it are working with fingers that answer more slowly, with every passing minute, gripping ice-glazed rope in the dark, fully aware that a single missed handhold means a fall onto a deck none of them can even see clearly anymore. Nobody below decks is lighting a fire for them. The ship cannot afford it, storm or no storm, and every man aloft knows it before he ever climbs. The same rules that protected the ship from an accidental blaze during an ordinary voyage applied with even greater force during a storm, when a pitching, rolling deck made any open flame catastrophically more likely to spread. Men suffering the earliest signs of frostbite, numb fingers, clumsy hands, the first creeping loss of feeling, had to keep working the ship regardless, because a poorly handled sail in a storm could kill the entire crew faster than the cold itself. Roberts's crew was not alone in facing this stretch of coastline. Other pirates worked the same waters in the years around his raid, drawn by the same seasonal wealth moving through Newfoundland's fishing ports, and the pattern holds across nearly every documented case. Crews arrived with the warmer months and left with them, treating the region as a lucrative summer hunting ground rather than a place to make a permanent home. That consistency across multiple captains, operating a full century apart and with no coordination between them, is itself a form of evidence. Independent crews reaching the identical conclusion, arrive after the ice clears and leave before it returns, points to a shared, hard-earned understanding of exactly how unforgiving these waters became once true winter set in. An understanding built on the wrecks and near disasters of sailors who came before them and did not plan as carefully. This is the twist at the heart of the story. The single greatest threat to a pirate crew caught in a North Atlantic cold snap was rarely the temperature alone. It was the impossible choice built into the ship itself, between the fire that might warm frozen hands and the fire that might destroy the vessel outright, with no way to have one without risking the other. Bartholomew Roberts avoided this trap by timing his raids to the safest possible window. Not every captain, and not every crew caught by an early storm on the Grand Banks had that luxury. For those men, survival came down entirely to the wool on their backs, the coals glowing in a covered dish below decks, and the discipline not to reach for the one solution that could sink the ship faster than the storm ever would. Strip away the black flags and the reputation for lawlessness, and what remains in this story is a group of men who survived some of the harshest conditions in the Atlantic world through nothing more dramatic than discipline, preparation, and the willingness to go without the one comfort that instinct told them they needed most. That is, in the end, the part of pirate history that rarely gets told. The popular image sells piracy as a life free of rules, a rejection of every authority and every restraint that governed ordinary sailors. According to the actual historical record, the opposite was closer to the truth in at least one crucial respect. A pirate crew operating in the North Atlantic followed the fire discipline of every other wooden ship of the era, without exception, because the ship itself did not care whether the men aboard it flew a black flag or a king's commission. Wood burns the same way regardless of who owns it. Gunpowder detonates the same way whether it belongs to a privateer or an outlaw. The sea does not negotiate, and neither did the rule against open flame. None of this required special courage in the way the word is usually meant. It required something closer to routine, the kind of unglamorous consistency that never gets its own dramatic scene in a film, but that quietly decides who lives and who does not. A man on watch at 2 a.m, hands numb inside wet mittens, did not need to be fearless. He needed to keep working the same rigging, in the same rotation, following the same rules he had followed the night before, until his relief arrived. Multiply that by every freezing night of a long northern voyage, across dozens of men on a single ship, and the real engine behind these survival stories starts to look less like heroism and more like habit, repeated until it became close to instinct. There is a wider truth buried in this story that goes well beyond pirates and beyond the 1700s. Every dangerous environment eventually forces the people inside it to give up an obvious short-term comfort in exchange for a better chance at long-term survival. A freezing sailor wanted fire more than almost anything else in the world during a North Atlantic storm. And yet the single decision that kept the entire crew alive was the discipline to deny that want, night after night, for the sake of a ship that could not survive the very solution his body was begging him to use. Modern life removes most of us from decisions with stakes that clear. But the underlying pattern has never disappeared. The instinct that feels most urgent in a crisis is not always the one that keeps you alive, and the people who survive the harshest environments are very often the ones who have trained themselves to recognize the difference before it is too late. According to everything the surviving records show, men like Peter Easton and Bartholomew Roberts understood this trade-off well enough to build their entire strategy around it, choosing when to sail these waters as carefully as they chose which ships to attack. The crews who followed them inherited the same hard lesson, learned through generations of near disasters, doused galley fires, and frostbitten hands on freezing rigging. They did not conquer the North Atlantic winter. They respected it, planned around it, and when they had no choice but to face it unprepared, they endured it using nothing more than wool, contained embers, and each other's shared warmth in a crowded, freezing hold. It is worth pausing on how little credit this particular kind of endurance usually receives. History remembers pirates for their violence, their audacity, and their willingness to break every law placed in front of them. It rarely stops to notice that the same men were also capable of extraordinary, sustained self-restraint, night after night, in conditions that would break most people within hours. There is no dramatic single moment in this story, no cannon fire, no mutiny, no buried treasure. There is only the quiet, repeated choice to stay cold rather than risk the ship, made by ordinary sailors who are almost never named in the histories written about their captains. That absence of individual credit is, in its own way, part of the point. Survival at sea in this era was rarely the achievement of one bold decision. It was the accumulated result of thousands of small, disciplined ones, made by men whose names did not survive the way Roberts or Easton's did, but whose choices were every bit as essential to the ship making it home. So the next time the image of a pirate crew comes to mind, palm trees and warm turquoise water in the background, hold on to this other image instead. Late in the evening, somewhere north of the Grand Banks, the wind is already rising, and the first sleet is starting to sting exposed skin. Below decks, the galley fire has just been doused on the captain's order, the coals raked out and drenched before the storm can turn one stray ember into the end of the ship. A dozen men sit in near total darkness, wet wool pressed against wet wool, sharing warmth they cannot see. Nobody argues about it. Nobody asks for the fire back. Every man in that hold understands, without needing it explained, that the cold pressing in on them tonight is the safer enemy. Somewhere out past the hull, the real one is still building.